Here with more on the subject is our grumpy old man.
This is the Grumpy Old Man Podcast, hosted by Dave Mathwin. So close your yapper and just listen.
Welcome, everybody, for another episode and another great conversation, I'm sure. I'm very glad to have with us today Miss Audrey Blunt. Hello, Audrey.
Hello.
And Miss Emily Miller. Hello, Emily. Audrey is a freshman at Messiah College. Emily is a freshman at UVA, but they're both graduates of AFA, where I teach, and both graduated with high honors and acclaim this past May, or I should say this past June, and both were wonderful contributors to our government class. So today, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to discuss the political scene in general in America, not so much, I think, specifically of the candidates, but specifically our two-party system. Do we need a third party? What do we do? We seem to be in a kind of polarized deadlock. Where do we go from here? Ladies, I'll be interested in your thoughts. And so let's begin. Why do you guys think that democracies have tended to develop a two-party system? It's very common. It happened in the United States almost immediately, starting probably even a little bit before the election of 1800, so that's going way back. Of course, in England, where the colonists were drawing a lot of their tradition, there were basically two political parties, Whigs and Tories and so forth. If you go back into the Roman Republic, in the later stages, certainly of the Roman Republic, you had two political parties. It seems to be a thing that democracies do, for better or for worse. Why do you guys think that is? What is it about democracies that tends to foster these binary choices?
Yeah, you want to go first? Sure.
All right, Audrey, go ahead.
We talked a little bit about how I believe it has to do with you're sort of adopting a political identity. And Emily used the phrase, it's sort of us versus them. And in a sense, I believe it makes you feel as though you can magnify your vote because you're not just voting as an individual. In America, you're voting as a Republican or a Democrat. And so in that way, I feel like it makes you feel as though you can sort of magnify your own vote. And it's less chaotic in a sense, even compared to having three parties, much less to having no parties at all, where everyone just votes for who they think is the best candidate, regardless of party.
Hold on. So, Audrey, why do you think then? So, I like that idea, and I want to hear more. I know you're sorry, I did cut you off.
No, you're good.
But why then do you think? So, you're saying it magnifies your voice. A party. So. But hypothetically, a lot of people could be independents. They could register. Most states, I'm sure, allow you to register as independents, but I'm guessing that very few people take that option. Is that because the choices are already there? The only way to magnify your choice is to join the Republicans or Democrats, or magnify your ideology?
Yeah, I think so. I think it makes your vote feel less individual and more like you're with a group of people who share similar ideals, and that you can have a much bigger wave in a democracy as a group of Republicans or as Democrats.
How do you think then that it basically started with two? Like, couldn't have it started with three or four, like 3 or 4 options to magnify your voice?
Yeah, I think for sure it could have. You had good thoughts on this.
Yeah, so obviously I wrote my senior thesis kind of all about what two parties mean for us kind of as human beings. I think as people, we want to tribalize as much as possible. And the way we make our tribe stronger is by joining the biggest tribe. So I guess you could start out with multiple parties, but the way those parties get stronger is maybe by compromising their views and moving in with other parties. Like recently I watched a documentary. I love political documentaries and I watch them all the time. I watched one and there was mention of this thing called the Reform Party, which was prominent in the 90s. And people are talking about now the Republican Party taking on characteristics of the Reform Party.
Right. Yes, yes. Yes, I remember the Reform Party. I remember Ross Perot, who made a big splash in the 1992 election. But right, then it kind of died off and got, right, I think mostly absorbed by the Republican Party. Of course, there was the Tea Party a while ago. It was not quite the movement that the Reform Party was. You could argue the Republicans, again, kind of captured that party as well. So, Emily, you think then that this tribalization that human beings want to engage in, it kind of naturally leads to picking up, like everybody gathering up like as many, whatever sides they can. And so two is a kind of natural coalescing point.
Yeah, I mean, it may be around such things as whether or not you're more of a liberal or conservative person. But I mean, I think those labels in general don't even oftentimes really represent what the parties are even about. But yeah, I mean, I think if it makes the parties stronger, then they'll all come together. And also it makes it simpler. Like Audrey said earlier when we were talking about this, that it makes it really easy when you can just say we're the good guys and they're the bad guys. So I can't claim to understand like why we do that, but that's what it seems like at least.
So if it is fairly, if you guys are right, and I think you guys have made some interesting points, if you guys are right and it is fairly natural for this to happen, should we then conclude that it is a good thing that it happens?
This is interesting. This is where we get into disagreement. I think it is a bad thing. Emily thinks it's a better thing.
Yes,
right?
I think the two-party system is good, asterisk, but Audrey thinks you third parties are necessary.
I do, yes.
You know, what is interesting is, I think what is interesting is, and let's get to the specific third-party question, but I think to think about the number two is like, well, I'll tell you what, let me get to that later. But Plato had some interesting thoughts about the number two, so did Pythagoras, and there's some weirdness there. Maybe we can get into that. All right, so you guys are kind of split between thinking that the two-party system is basically good and essentially not. Emily, the two-party system is what we know. Give us your case for, hey, this is obviously what works for democracy, so let's essentially embrace it. Go ahead.
Yeah. So the reason I say two parties are good, asterisk, is I like the two-party system, and I'll say I do not like the two parties as they are right now. Part of the reason why, like, I almost never like to talk about my own political views or tell anyone what I believe at all is because I don't feel comfortable being associated with either party, because there's aspects of the party's identity and, you know, party's beliefs that I don't agree with. But in terms of the two-party system, I think it's good because ultimately whichever policies or candidates win, you're going to be pleasing about 50% of the nation, right? In terms of third parties, I've heard things about a lot of the reading I did earlier this year I did a paper on the Electoral College. A lot of the reading I did kind of mentioned British coalitions, and they have more than two parties, and it's kind of funny to watch their debates on TV. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but they all kind of just yell at each other over there. So I think you're going to be pleasing the most people, even if they do have to compromise a little bit if you have the two-party system.
I read somewhere, I can't vouch for sure that it's true, but in Israel, I think they have 17 political parties.
Yeah.
And so you
Like,
make
who would be happy?
right. So you make a good point. The two-party system, at least in theory, allows for at least 51% of the people to be pleased, whereas a multi-party system, 3, 4, or 5, you might only have somewhere around a third of the country being pleased. All right, Audrey, what would you say in response to that?
Yeah, I disagree a little bit because I think it reaches a certain point. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez used the term, like, the tent just gets too big. And at a certain point, people are forced to compromise huge values in order to fit into one side or another. And I think that's exactly what happened with this last election. Everyone had to compromise with Trump and with Biden because they thought, well, each person just has to try and defeat the other one. And so now we have two candidates that no one really wants to get behind, or very few people do, because so much compromise happened. And that's how I think we got into this position. But on a broader scale, I think that's how the two-party system can be very damaging, because, like we said, it absorbs certain groups, like conservative, like the Republican Party, in a sense, sort of absorbed like libertarianism and like paleoconservatism and all these different things. And I think there's just so much compromise going on that I don't think it's like 50% or more are happy with the candidate. I think that 50% or more are sort of just resigned to say, well, this is it. This is the best that we got, which has definitely been true for the last few elections. So I don't think that people are usually totally content with their party. And I think that that makes it much more difficult to vote your conscience, and much more difficult to vote in a person of virtue rather than a person of like strong political stance.
Right. Okay. So Audrey, you bring up something interesting. You talked about their voting your conscience, and again, I think people have different views about this as well. Some people see voting as we say an expression of themselves, of their values, something of their identity, of their conscience. Others seem to view voting as a kind of it was something much more pragmatic, something much more. Hey, we got to just, we need to build a bridge or whatever. So let's build a bridge in the best, most effective way we can. We don't normally think of like bridge building as an expression of the deep values, or or your conscience or something like that. I'm wondering. So Audrey, let's start with you. You mentioned that, and we'll get to you, Emily. Do you see voting? Is it very important to you, or do you think it's important for voting in general that you vote your conscience, quote unquote?
I absolutely think we do. Yeah, not to get like super religious, but I think there's a reason that like in the Bible, Christ abstained from associating himself with politics. And I think as Christians, there's a reason that we address things not just as like, this is what needs to be done, this is what we're doing for our government. I think we have to think about things from a moral perspective, from a Christian perspective, especially when it can have big impacts on our society.
Emily, how do you see things?
Yeah, well, okay. I tend to be very fatalistic just about politics in general. So when you say voting your conscience, I feel like a lot of politics kind of takes away all morality. There's corruption on both sides, and it's really hard to ever do like the morally correct thing in politics, because that's not really an option a lot of the time. And then back to Audrey's point about how, well, if we want to be as morally right as we can when we're voting, then we need a third party, and we can't let the two parties kind of absorb parties or kind of belief systems that we shouldn't associate ourselves with. And then I just lost my train of thought. To that, I would say that is something that would increase polarization a lot if we're like, okay, well, we can't associate ourselves with this group of people, and we can't associate ourselves with this group of people. and then you're back to the whole cycle of whenever we do vote someone into power, it's going to turn out that not a lot of people like them. Does that make sense?
Yes. So yeah, I think you guys have both touched on points of interest that are both sort of true, right? There's aspect, like Audrey is emphasizing essentially perhaps purity to an extent in a certain way. Emily, you're kind of emphasizing the need to be, shall we say, open. You can't go through life without, you have to rub shoulders with, you might have to work on a project with someone, at work, with someone maybe you think is not a good person. You might live next door to someone who, is not maybe the greatest person, but your neighbors, and you have to get along. So there's that need for, shall we say, quote, compromise on some level just to get on in the world. But Audrey's point is true too. You can't just be open to anything and everything.
And obviously I'm not saying
there's this balance between being, shall we say, open and closed to the world. Audrey, what would you say to that point that Emily makes, that, you're not going to win no matter what you choose, but we do have to do these things. We do need a political system. We do need, the roads maintained, and we do need the things that government is going to do. So just writing in like your pastor or your mom or your grandmother or something is going to be great at this. It's just, how would you respond?
Right. I think there's a lot of issues going into this. I think the way we vote is one of them. I think there are issues with the Electoral College that we could get into that make it very hard for candidates that aren't on extremes to win. Hassan Minhaj did an interesting piece on this on his show Patriot Act, where he talks about how voting between two candidates almost ensures that they won't have the majority of the support, especially when there's more candidates than just two. And so I think the way we vote needs reform. And then it would probably, I believe, be possible for us to elect someone that is more favorable to more than just a 50% or less.
Emily, any thoughts on that?
So I think what Audrey's referring to is the concept of vote rank, which
ranked choice vote.
Or ranked choice vote, yeah. Which I know a few states have employed very successfully. I am in favor of that, and I did want to clarify a little bit what I said earlier. Obviously, I'm not saying that we should just vote for whatever because it's all bad, and we shouldn't vote our conscience, and we shouldn't have to worry about voting morally. Obviously, vote for what you think. Yes, vote as a good person, I guess. But at the same time, I think it's unreasonable to think that there's any politician out there who is completely morally good. I mean, it's the whole establishment is run by mere human beings. So
sure. So no matter who you vote for, it's impossible to stay, pure as a driven snow.
Yeah.
In your associations with politics in general, basically, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
But you're also not saying, so just go ahead and swim in it, it doesn't matter. So I tend to think that 2, it may be a natural number, but because I think of some of the reasons you've said, you want to add to your being in a sense, and you want to kind of team up, and that tends to naturally form up on sides. But 2 is a tricky number. Even, in a kind of mythological sense, I mentioned, I mentioned Plato earlier. Now I was looking for a way to confirm this with primary sources this afternoon. I couldn't do it, but I did read something that suggests that, Plato, for example, thought that 2, it essentially has no meaning because 2 implies a relationship, and a relationship would naturally then lead to something coming from that relationship. which I thought was really interesting, because let's say you have a marriage, right? You have a man, you have a woman, right? Two becoming one, but those two, essentially, it needs, the two coming together should lead to, first comes love, then comes marriage, then comes, such and such and baby carriages, right? It should produce some kind of fruit. And then secondarily, it needs mediating. That two-ness, right, needs mediated. You need, right, the priest, right, to bring the two together. This kind of dichotomy, light, dark, life, death, it's certainly there in creation. But here's another thing I thought was interesting. I don't know what to make of it. But the second day of creation, it's the only day, I think, where it doesn't say, and it was good. The second day kind of hangs out there. Now, I don't know what to make of it. I don't want to make much of it. But I think it's two, I do think, is a dangerous number up at a certain point, because it's either us, them, and there's no, like on a seesaw, right? You can't really stay in the middle. I'm sure you guys remember trying to be on a seesaw and, like, oh, can we bounce? No. Eventually, you're going to go this, it's going to go like that, and someone's going to lose, someone's going to win. I do wonder about the number 3, however. And could a third party be a kind of mediator between the two, where you would each side, maybe like a 40-40-20, where each side would have to get enough of that mediating party that could maybe be, I don't know, liberal in economic policies but conservative in social policies, or vice versa, or something like that. Do the two parties, one thing that bothers me today, and I'll be curious for reaction, is that there's nothing really to mediate between the two parties. Maybe the press used to do that, but not anymore. The press is partisan, either on the right or left. There's no mediating force, and the two can't really produce. It's not a marriage. The Republicans and Democrats, it's not a marriage anymore. It's not really producing fruit, we might say. That might be my argument for a third party. What do you guys think?
I completely agree. I think that the idea of a mediating force and like what that would be, because right now I think of like the major third parties that we have, like the Green Party and libertarianism, and all of that seems to be that when we create third parties, it's not so much a mediating force as they have been like extreme ends of one party. Like the Green Party, in my mind, I associate with like very far left, and liberalism I associate with like very far right. And libertarians. What did I say? Liberalism. Oh yeah, libertarianism, very far right. So I think a third party that would be somewhere in the middle of the two would be ideal for our democracy. I completely agree. What are your thoughts?
What you described, Mr. Math, when you said, maybe people who are, maybe economically conservative and socially liberal, or socially conservative and economically liberal, I think those people exist. And I think if that's what you're talking about by a third party, then yeah, they kind of are the mediators, because those are the people that the other two parties are trying to win over. Right. And so in a sense, the two parties have to become more moderate, less extreme, in order to win over those parties. So if that's those people rather, if that's the third party you're talking about, I think that kind of already exists. Like, I'd say personally, I have beliefs on both sides. I mean, do you have beliefs on both sides? Yeah. Oh, yeah. So I think it kind of exists informally as here's the kind of moderates, or whatever you want to call them.
So you think then that what I described, I mean, it's already there in our two parties anyway. You have maybe some Democrats that might be a little bit more fiscally conservative but socially liberal, possibly, and some Republicans certainly a lot of libertarians do vote Republican. Like that would be the socially liberal but fiscally conservative. So you say, Emily, that already exists. We don't need it. It already exists.
Yeah, because like Audrey said, the other third parties are just on the extremes, right? So
right.
the main ones, at least, it seems.
Yeah. So the mediating force already exists. I guess here's maybe an argument for the two parties. Because that party I suggested, if you had a socially conservative, economically liberal party, you would then get its mirror image. And so then you'd have four. And so then the two would just pair up again, right? And then you'd have the same problem. So you suggested maybe as a way out of this, what did you call it? What was the word you used?
Rank vote choice?
Ranked choice voting?
Ranked choice voting. Thank you very much. Yes, I read about this too. This exists in some states and some other countries. For those in our audience who might not be familiar with this, can you explain ranked choice voting?
Oh, this is difficult. I would refer you to the episode of Patriot Act that describes it. I'll be able to. So essentially, the idea is, especially if you have more than one candidate, if someone gets less than 50%, well, okay, so when you vote, you would vote who you want first, second, third, fourth.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you vote, if someone gets more than 50%, they win. If no one gets more than 50%, which would be the most likely, then the bottom candidate is dropped out, and the people who voted for that person, their second choice goes to the person they voted for until there's two candidates or until someone gets a majority. So in that way, you assure that it's not just going to the next person who won't have a majority, but you're at least getting a majority even if it's their second or even third choice.
I think this is especially for like primary voting, if you're talking about a presidency. So.
Yeah, this can work, I think, really well for primaries. And don't Democratic primaries, I mean, while they run a little bit like that, like you keep, as long as you maintain a certain threshold of delegates, right, or a certain percentage of the vote, you keep those delegates. So maybe one candidate gets like 40%, another 30, another 20, but they'll all get those delegates. I think Republican primaries are winner take all. So you can win just like 35% of the vote. As long as you're the highest vote getter in Republican primaries, you win. But I don't know how well ranked choice voting would work in a presidential election. Like it certainly wouldn't necessarily work in a two-party presidential election, right? It could work for
not the primaries, the actual general election.
Right, the actual general elections.
I don't know.
Because in two parties, someone has to get more than 50.
Right.
There's just two.
Right. So basically, right, on the general elections, we would need at least, we would need at least 3 or maybe 4 or 5 potentially parties to work in a general election, and we're not there now. Another possible argument, so I'm in favor of third parties, and actually, if I had my cards on the table, I'd probably approach voting more like you, Audrey, than like you, Emily. Although go team, right? But Emily, you make some really good points, and I'm personally torn. Like, most elections, I kind of stand in line thinking probably what I'm going to do, but never entirely sure. What would you say, though, Audrey, since we're both on this more pro third party, more voting your conscience, to the fact that these two parties can tend to absorb fringe extremes and mediate between the extremes. And I'm thinking of like the Weimar Republic in Germany, which had many parties, right? And perhaps a little bit too under the provisional government after the fall of the Tsar in Russia, right? It was the multiplicity of parties in both circumstances that you could argue helped foster the rise of like the Nazi Party or the Bolshevik Party, giving them that foot in the door that they were able to kind of, use as a wedge. But if they had to immediately be absorbed into larger parties, some of those extreme edges would have had to necessarily been worn off. What would you say to that, Audrey?
Yeah, I think it sort of comes back to, like, in American democracy, at least, I feel like, and I do this often, but I think everyone sort of sees politics as like a line. And Republican is on this side and Democrats on this side, and you can be somewhere, you know, like on the scale, but ultimately it's just a line, and you're somewhere along that line. So I think that that has majorly contributed to the idea that, like, even if you consider yourself, say, like socially conservative, in all else, you might be on like the liberal side, and so you would be considered like a Democrat, if that makes sense, but just like a more mild one. So I think that's a really interesting concept. I don't know. Do you have thoughts? Because
On which part?
On the two parties as mediating forces of extremes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's another reason I'd say I'm pretty pro two-party, because that way at least you're getting away from polarization. You're kind of pulling everyone back in, which, you know, I'm a very strong proponent of not having extremes, basically. Wouldn't call myself extreme in my political beliefs. And I think even if we have to compromise a little bit, I think it's important not to be extreme, because that can lead to a lot of issues and unrest and hate. So
let's get to this argument, which, and again, I've heard both sides. There's the side that says, even if you don't like either candidate, and I think many voters will not be super fond of either candidate in this coming November, you need to vote for the one that, that you dislike the least, whatever. Vote for the one that you find the most palatable. Because if you don't do that, you're essentially A, absenting yourself from the process, and B, essentially giving a vote to the other guy. But there are others that say no. Like, if we want a third-party system, A, well, you should vote your conscience, or B, like, you need, like, somehow at some point, if we need more parties, it's got to happen somewhere at some point in some time. It might as well be now. Where do you guys stand on this? Audrey, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I've never really been a fan of the idea that, like, unless it's a local election, which I feel like are very important, especially in presidential elections, and when we're down to two candidates that no one really likes, I strongly oppose the idea that, like, you owe society your vote more than you owe yourself voting for your conscience, or more than you owe your faith voting for your conscience. Because I think if morally you cannot get behind either decision, you don't owe anyone that. And I think there's a lot of pressure on people to vote for, like, the least bad one. But I think that places unfair pressure on the voter, and especially in, like, a religious sort of context where you, based on your faith, you feel like you can't vote for either one. And so, yeah, I'm strongly opposed to that pressure.
yeah.
Emily?
I mean, yeah, that's exactly why I qualified my statement earlier and said that I like the two-party system, but I don't like the two parties. I really hate how we have to, like, at this point, it's lesser of two evils. I mean, at this point, we're probably just preaching to the choir, right? But it's a tough situation to be in, definitely. And I don't know if there's much we can do to fix it, rather than, like, I don't know, just use your conscience to weigh your options, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I do think it is interesting. You know, Americans, we thrive, you know, at least so-called, right, thrive on diversity and thrive on multiplicity of options. And we love to have all kinds of options, you know, with the clothes we buy or the music we listen to or the movies we watch or what have you. And we tend to believe, right, that increasing your choices is a way, is good. It's the American way, except in politics, which I find unusual, where it seems like A, we can't find a way to increase our options, and B, even when we can, some people think that we shouldn't. Yeah, I think that is an intriguing thing. You know, there was briefly for a few weeks, there was a libertarian candidate, Justin Amash, Representative Amash, or Amash, I believe it's pronounced. Apologies. But he faded away. And then, of course, you had the media event of Kanye West declaring his candidacy. And I was hoping you guys might be able to shed some light, you know, you guys being young and hip and all that. What was your reaction to Kanye West's candidacy?
In a humorous sort of way, I feel like it was the same way people reacted to like young Donald Trump being like, I'm gonna be president one day. Because it honestly, like, it sounds like it's coming from a place of privilege and possibly lack of experience in politics. I would not vote for Kanye West. I don't think anyone would politically.
Yeah.
If you can tell me one thing Kanye would like put into action in the White House, I would be very surprised.
You wouldn't vote for a third party. In other words, it would matter who the third party candidate was. It just couldn't just be anybody.
Yeah.
All right, Emily?
So I know his party is the birthday party.
Is it really?
Yeah. Did you not know that? No. Well, okay. So I think we do have to look at this on like a case by case basis, and I think we should definitely talk about it. I think with Kanye West, we have to remember something the media is talking about a lot and something he's talked about a lot. He is bipolar, so people are saying he's kind of having like a bipolar episode, which is, well, that's whatever. But anyway, if we can kind of look at this in the really big picture of celebrities kind of entering the political sphere. Like, obviously, we saw Donald Trump do it. He's someone who didn't have political experience. It apparently was a pretty big deal back when, I guess, was it JFK, who was like an actor?
Sure.
Yeah, I read that was a big deal.
I mean, with JFK, you mean Ronald Reagan?
Or I mean Reagan, sorry.
Right. But Reagan was governor of California. I mean, he did have some political experience before running for president. But before that, yes, his career was an acting, yes.
Yeah, I mean, Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor.
Arnold Schwarzenegger, again, governor of California.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an example of the Overton window expanding, which I know that's kind of pertains more to discourse, but the fact that these people are able to enter into our political discourse and we kind of take them as legitimate. Like, there's actual celebrities who are saying we should vote for Kanye West for president, right. And like they mean it, like they're being serious.
Right.
Like, I think that's significant, and it kind of shows that political professionalism is probably on a decline. So,
yes, interesting. Now, can you explain, Emily, for our audience, this concept of the Overton window?
Yes, gladly. This is a concept that Mrs. Mathman introduced me to. It's basically the concept that as the window expands, more and more political discourse of different types is considered acceptable. Like, for example, now we talk about socialism, democratic socialism, like it's normal. Like, that's like
right.
an actual thing that's like part of the Democratic Party now. And some of the things that Donald Trump has said, some of his rhetoric, that's right. considered normal now. Whereas maybe like 50 or 60 years ago, a politician bringing this stuff up would have been like crazy, you know? So I think the fact that celebrities kind of, and also the fact that celebrities insert themselves into political discourse now, like crazy, I think that is an example of the window kind of opening up.
Yes. So you're saying, by the Overton window here for our audience, again, you're saying the kind of the stretching of what is considered, quote, normal.
Or acceptable.
Or acceptable, right. You know, yes, I think that's an excellent point, Emily. I think that Kanye West's candidacy, of course, I don't I don't think it's going to go anywhere. I don't think it's going to generate any kind of vote or any kind of political traction. However, I do think the fact of his candidacy is interesting and kind of related to what you said. In Shakespeare's King Lear, it's the fool, the king's fool, that becomes, in some ways, the hero of the story. The fool is usually supposed to make things crazy. But when things get really crazy, right, it's the fool that enters in to speak sense. The fool can kind of knock it back. Or at least that's what happens in King Lear. Because now the crazy thing, quote unquote, the crazy thing is the sane thing. I do think that his candidacy is an indication that, right, it's not a good indication of our political discourse. I don't think many people are taking it seriously, but could it, I guess, here's my question. Could this, Kanye West is, like you said, the party is the birthday party. He is a jester. He is like a court jester. Could this have any kind of salutary effect? Could the clown point us in a more sane direction?
One second, Mr. Mathman. We're actually on the podcast right now.
Yo, sick.
Jack's here.
Oh, all right.
Mr. Mathman, I got your email.
All right. Hey, thanks, Jack. And yeah, you guys check out. Might be doing. So, ladies and gentlemen, Jack might be doing the audio and intro format and stuff like that. Should be interesting. That's credit to Jack. Well, all right now. Here we go. What do you think of that, ladies?
You repeat the question?
Yeah. Right. Is it possible that Kanye West may play the role of the fool in King Lear and knock things back into their rightful position, or at least knock it back in the right direction? In other words, if you go really far, right, like if you follow the comedian as far as you can go, then it's the comedian that maybe can lead you back.
Right.
I don't know. Does that make sense, first of all, that concept?
Honestly, I don't think we're at the point where Kanye would be the solution. I think
Not
that's
even for president. I mean, the fact of his candidacy. Will it inject in a kind of weird, kind of unusual way? Like in Dante, right? Dante, in his comedy, he's crawling down. He's at the lowest pits of hell. And then he keeps on crawling down. But then in crawling down, he finds he's actually then crawling up the Mount Purgatory. I guess that's what I mean. Not that he himself will be president or should be, but is the fact of his candidacy perhaps a kind of down is up kind of moment? Right.
I see what you mean. Yeah. I think that's definitely possible. I don't know.
I don't think so. I don't think that's gonna happen because I mean, Joe Exotic ran for president, and
Right.
yeah, I think maybe if Kanye's candidacy was more talked about, like if he had like a lot of supporters saying that he should run for president, maybe, but I don't think he has that many supporters. But I mean, I think it's the fact that he has a platform at all, or the fact that he has any supporters at all, that's kind of significant.
Right.
Yes. Perhaps it means that we may have reached the end or are coming to the end of a certain cultural cycle, right? Where that maybe some kind of reset is needed, right? The fool in King Lear does not become king, right? He does not solve all of the problems. He cannot fix the problems, but he is an indicator that a certain kind of cycle is over and it resets, but just not quite the same way. Having advanced this theory, I also don't think that we're there yet, but I think it is intriguing. I think it is intriguing and worth watching. I think that depending on what happens in this, over these next few years, we may see this again. Okay, we've talked a little bit about this ending of cycles, and perhaps we're getting a little pessimistic.
I'm always pessimistic.
Definitely.
Yeah. Isn't anything new for me.
Right. So, what do you guys think will happen next? Will the ship right itself with one of these two candidates? At the moment, again, we're recording this right at the beginning of August. At the moment, Biden is ahead in the polls and seems likely to win, as of early August, but we'll see what happens. Do you see either one of these candidates as having the ability to kind of reset everything and reestablish a proper new normal? Or do you see that, no, this is probably going to continue no matter who gets elected?
I think it is very likely to continue if we don't start implementing changes while one of them is in office. I think it's less likely to happen if Trump is elected, just because I think everyone will be so mad for the next 4 years that not much will get done. But I think in the next I think it will be determined over the course of the next 4 years, honestly. If change starts being implemented into how we vote and who is going to be running, then I think it will be possible. But I think it's one of those things we'll also have to see. I do think it's more likely, though, if Biden is elected.
I don't think it's going to come down to whichever candidate's elected, because I think the parties have snowballed by themselves.
Right.
I think at this point they don't even necessarily need candidates to rally around, because they've already done that. And if you think about it, Bernie Sanders supporters, even though he's out of the election, out of the race, his supporters are still his supporters and are really attached to his, policies. So those people still exist without, kind of the figurehead. I don't think it's going to matter, honestly. And I know that's fatalistic of me once again, but I think we've already gone too far.
Right. Well, Emily, I have to say, this grumpy old man probably more agrees with you. I agreed with Audrey earlier. I'm going to agree with you this time. I don't see any particular reason for parties, if we talk about changes in voting, I think our current system obviously serves the two parties as they exist now well. And I don't see why they would want to change that system. I think that it would be very interesting. Now, as of this, when this is recorded, we don't know yet who Biden's running mate will be. I think that's going to be a very interesting choice, not just because of Biden's health, but because that's the one thing in the race right now that we don't know. And how he chooses that person, or what that person is like, I think will may orient the electorate one way or the other. So it may happen. There may be a new reset, but I don't know. I'm skeptical, but I would love to see. And this is why I say maybe we need not to be president, but maybe we need the quote the fool. Are we in a King Lear moment? I hope not, but I wonder if maybe we are. Audrey, but you're the more optimistic of the three. So give us a good case for, no, wait, this can happen. We're doing all right. We're going to right the ship. It'll be fine.
It's because of the conversations I've seen happening. Largely, I think people are having conversations like ours. Everyone is unhappy with the candidates. So I think if that sparks a lot more conversation, I really think that's how we're going to fix it. If people realize that they're not stuck in the two parties, they don't have to like go to these two sort of like polar opposite sides. I think it's going to take a lot of conversation, but I think especially if this continues, people are going to get increasingly upset with the structure of our democracy and the structure of voting. And so I think that change is likely. I mean, America, that's sort of what our whole, like, that's sort of what we're all about, is like, you know, constantly creating the better form of government for our citizens. And we're constantly trying to progress. And so I think that it is certainly possible.
We have it within us to right the ship. Very good. Audrey, I certainly hope so. And that's a good thought. Emily, do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it's just important to remember in the midst of all of it that politics is probably always going to disappoint us to some extent. So just try to be a good person and don't let it all consume you too much, because there's bad people on every end of it. So
There's
also good people.
Yeah, I think
there's good people in both parties.
right. Audrey, I think on that you probably would agree. Resist being sucked in too deeply on either side. Yes, and try and maintain bridges across the aisle. That sounds good to me. I'm always up for good conversation, as you know. Ladies, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been great to see you again, and great to hear your thoughts on this very timely issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Audrey, thank you too, and best of luck to you at Messiah, and best of luck to you, Emily, at UVA.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. We hope to see you again for another episode, and until then, bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Grumpy Old Man podcast. Be sure to come back for more episodes and to check out his companion blog at stickthemud.com.